The person you love is saying, "Please read this message now, before I make my final decision." Something happened in the middle of an ordinary night that made one person stop, stare at their phone, and realize they could no longer keep pretending everything was fine. The message was already written. The words were sitting there, waiting to be sent. Their finger hovered over the screen, then pulled away. They read it again. And again. Because this wasn't a casual text. It wasn't an emotional impulse. It was a decision they had been carrying quietly for far longer than you realize. And the first line said, "Please read this message now. Not tomorrow. Not when you have time. Now." Because something between you had reached a moment where silence could no longer protect either of you. They had questions they were afraid to ask, feelings they couldn't keep hiding, and one final choice they believed they might have to make. But here's the part that changes everything: they weren't preparing to walk away because they stopped caring. They were preparing to decide what to do with feelings that had become impossible to ignore. Picture the scene. The room is quiet. The lights are low. Their phone is the only thing illuminating their face. They begin typing what they've wanted to say for weeks, maybe even months. Then they stop at one sentence because it suddenly feels too honest. They erase it. Type something else. Erase that too. Finally, they put the phone down and take a slow breath. Why is this so difficult? Because they know that once the message reaches you, the situation can't return to the way it was before. They're not asking for a perfect answer. They're asking for an honest one. And somewhere beneath all the hesitation is a thought they haven't been brave enough to say directly: "Do you still see a future for us?" That question explains why the message feels so urgent. They aren't simply waiting for your reply. They're watching for a sign that tells them whether to keep believing in this connection or finally protect their own heart by choosing a different direction. But there is one detail they haven't told you yet, and it may explain why their decision suddenly became so serious. Because recently, something changed inside them. Not necessarily because of another person. Not because their feelings disappeared. In fact, it may be the opposite. They started realizing just how much your presence had affected their life. A conversation you barely remember may still be replaying in their mind. A small kindness you thought meant nothing may have stayed with them. A moment when you looked at them without judgment may have become one of the memories they return to whenever they feel uncertain. And now they're standing between two choices: continue waiting for clarity, or finally ask you for it. That's why their message carries so much weight. They're not trying to pressure you. They're trying to understand whether the door between you is still open. And if you've been wondering why their energy suddenly feels different, why their words seem more careful, why they may have become quieter instead of more distant, stay with this, because the next part of their message reveals the one thing they're hoping you'll say before they make that final decision. The strange part is, they almost didn't send the message at all. Their thumb hovered over the screen for several seconds, and then something made them stop. They realized they weren't actually afraid of your answer. They were afraid of what your silence might mean. For so long, they had been trying to read between your words, studying the pauses in your conversations, remembering the moments when you seemed close and the moments when you suddenly pulled back. And tonight, they finally admitted something to themselves: guessing was becoming harder than knowing. So they opened the message again and added one sentence they had been too vulnerable to write before. "I need to know where I stand with you." That sentence wasn't about demanding a commitment. It was about wanting clarity. Because behind all their confidence, there was a quiet uncertainty they had hidden remarkably well. They wondered whether you still felt the same connection they did, or whether they had been holding on to something that existed only in their own heart. And then came the part they never expected themselves to say. They began remembering the beginning. Not just the obvious moments, but the tiny ones. The conversation that lasted longer than planned, the unexpected laugh, the look that lingered for 1 second too long, the moment when being around you suddenly felt different from being around everyone else. Those memories had become more important with time, not less. That's why this decision isn't as simple as walking away. There's history here. There's emotion here. There's something unfinished. And perhaps the biggest surprise is that they believe you may not even realize how deeply they've been affected by you. If this message is already reminding you of someone, you can quietly share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes putting a feeling into words helps you understand what your heart has been trying to tell you. And if you enjoy stories that explore those complicated moments between two people, you're always welcome to stay connected here. But just when they thought they had finally figured out what they wanted to say, they noticed something on the screen that changed the entire tone of the message. It was your name. Suddenly, all the rehearsed words disappeared. They weren't thinking about winning you over anymore. They weren't thinking about proving anything. They were thinking about one simple possibility: what if you actually read everything and still chose them? That question stopped them cold. Because beneath the phrase, "final decision," was a hope they had never completely abandoned. They wanted to know whether there was still something worth building, something worth protecting, something worth giving another chance. And now the message became more honest. They were going to tell you what they had been holding back, not because they wanted to create pressure, but because they were tired of hiding behind silence. Yet there was one final sentence they couldn't bring themselves to send. And when you discover what that sentence was, you'll understand why they have been waiting for your response all this time. There was one sentence sitting at the bottom of the screen that they kept deleting before sending it again. Every time they saw it, their expression changed. Because those few words carried more truth than everything else they had written. They finally typed, "I don't want to make this decision without hearing you." Then they stared at it. That was the real reason behind the urgency. They weren't simply announcing a final choice. They were giving you one last opportunity to be honest with them before they decided what their next chapter would look like. For weeks, they had tried to convince themselves that they could move forward without asking you anything. They told themselves they were strong enough to accept whatever happened. But when the moment finally arrived, they discovered something unexpected. They didn't want closure nearly as much as they wanted clarity. And that realization forced them to confront a question they had been avoiding: what if the answer they've been waiting for has been closer than they ever realized? Then they remembered the last time they saw you. There was something different about that moment. Maybe neither of you said what you were really thinking. Maybe the conversation ended normally, but the silence afterward felt unusually heavy. They noticed the little things: the way you looked away when the conversation became personal, the pause before you answered, the expression you tried to hide. At the time, they didn't know what any of it meant. Now they're wondering if they misread everything. And that uncertainty has become the center of their decision. They aren't asking you to promise something impossible. They simply want to know whether there is still a genuine feeling between you that deserves another chance. Because sometimes two people don't drift apart because the connection disappeared. They drift because neither person wants to be the first one to admit how much they still care. And this person may finally be ready to break that silence. But what they wrote next was even more revealing. They added another line, paused, and almost laughed at themselves because it sounded so vulnerable. If you still feel something, please tell me before I let go. Then the room became completely quiet. They read those words several times. This was no longer about pride. It was about choosing honesty over guessing. They knew they couldn't stay suspended between hope and uncertainty forever. And yet, even after everything, they were still leaving the door open. That tells you something important. When someone truly feels nothing, they usually don't need one final conversation. They don't stare at a message for 20 minutes wondering whether to send it. They simply move forward. This person hasn't done that. They're still waiting because a part of them believes your story together may not be finished. And just when their finger finally moved toward the send button, they remembered one moment that could completely change what they decide next. The send button was right there, but they suddenly remembered something you once said without realizing how deeply it would stay with them. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was something simple, almost forgettable. You told them that when you truly care about someone, you don't always know how to explain it, you just keep showing up in the ways you can. That memory came rushing back at exactly the moment they were preparing to make their final decision. They looked at the message again and wondered whether they had been judging your feelings only by the words you didn't say. Maybe they had overlooked the small things. Maybe your silence had never meant indifference. Maybe you had been waiting for them to take the first step because you were afraid of being misunderstood too. And suddenly, the decision didn't feel as final anymore. It felt like a doorway. One conversation could reveal whether there was still something real waiting on the other side. Then they did something unexpected. Instead of sending the message immediately, they opened an old conversation between you. They scrolled slowly through the messages, stopping at certain lines. A joke. A late-night conversation. A moment when one of you checked on the other for no reason. A sentence that seemed ordinary back then but now carried an entirely different meaning. Their expression softened. They realized they weren't remembering the relationship because they wanted to live in the past. They were looking for evidence of something much simpler, whether the connection had ever been genuine. And the more they looked, the harder it became to convince themselves that it wasn't. That's when they understood what their final decision actually meant. They weren't deciding whether they cared. They already knew they did. They were deciding whether they were brave enough to stop protecting themselves from the possibility of being hurt and finally ask you for the truth. And before you assume you already know where this is going, there's another layer you need to hear. They had prepared themselves for two possible answers from you. One would give them the courage to stay. The other would give them permission to finally move forward. Either way, they wanted to stop living in uncertainty. That's why the message began with, "Please read this now." They didn't want their words buried beneath another day of distractions, assumptions, or unfinished conversations. They wanted you to see the emotion behind every sentence. And if you've ever cared about someone but waited too long to say what was really in your heart, you'll understand why this moment matters. If this story is connecting with you, feel free to share what you think in the comments, and if you want more emotionally driven stories like this, you can stay connected for the next one. Because now they were finally ready to press send. But what happened immediately after that could reveal whether this was truly the end of something, or the beginning of a completely different chapter. The message finally left their screen, and for several seconds, nothing happened. No response. No notification. Just silence. They placed the phone beside them and tried to convince themselves they were relieved. But their eyes kept drifting back toward it. They had just said the things they had spent so long protecting. There was nowhere left to hide behind vague conversations or carefully chosen words. Now the answer belonged to you. And that waiting period became its own kind of story. Every vibration made them look up. Every passing minute felt longer than the one before. But beneath the nervousness was something they hadn't expected to feel: peace. Because whatever happened next, they had finally been honest. They had told you they still cared. They had admitted they were tired of guessing. And most importantly, they had given you a chance to tell them what they had been afraid to ask directly. But then, just as they began to put the phone away for good, the screen lit up. It wasn't your reply. It was something else. A reminder from an older conversation that suddenly brought one particular memory back into focus. They opened it, and there it was, a message from you that they had saved without ever telling you. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was simply a moment when you had reassured them during a difficult day. They remembered exactly where they were when they received it. They remembered how unexpectedly safe that conversation had made them feel. And suddenly they understood why letting go had been so difficult. It wasn't just about missing someone. It was about missing the version of themselves that existed when they felt truly understood. That realization changed the question completely. They stopped asking, "Should I stay?" and started asking, "Have we actually given this a fair chance?" Those are two very different questions. One comes from exhaustion. The other comes from hope. And somewhere inside them, hope was quietly winning. Then your name appeared on the screen. A new notification. Their heart jumped. They didn't open it immediately. They stared at the preview, almost afraid that one sentence could change everything. They took a breath and finally tapped the screen. Your response wasn't what they expected. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't an immediate promise. It was something far more meaningful, a question. A question that showed you had actually understood what they were trying to say. They read it once. Then twice. Their entire expression changed. Because suddenly, the conversation wasn't about one person chasing and another person deciding. For the first time, both of you were standing in the same place, asking what could happen if you stopped assuming and started speaking honestly. But there was still one thing they hadn't told you. One truth they had deliberately left out of the original message because they weren't sure how you'd react. And when they finally reveal it, you'll understand why their final decision was never really about walking away. The truth they had kept out of the message was sitting in their mind long before they ever opened that conversation. They had been afraid to tell you because it made them feel exposed in a way they weren't used to. They weren't waiting for some perfect moment. They were waiting to see whether you would care enough to ask. And when your response arrived, something about the way you asked your question made them realize you were listening differently this time. So they finally admitted it. I was never trying to decide whether I cared about you. I was trying to decide whether I could keep pretending I didn't. Those words changed the atmosphere instantly. Because suddenly, the silence, the hesitation, and even the distance between you started making sense. They had been fighting an internal battle between what they felt and what they thought they were supposed to do. And the closer they came to walking away, the more obvious it became that their feelings hadn't disappeared. They had simply become too important to keep ignoring. Then they told you about the moment that made them reconsider everything. It happened during an ordinary day, in the middle of something completely unrelated. They saw something that reminded them of you. A familiar phrase, a place you once talked about, maybe even a song playing quietly in the background. Normally, they would have brushed it aside. This time, they couldn't. They stopped what they were doing and realized how naturally you had become part of their thoughts. Not because they were forcing themselves to remember you, but because memories of you had quietly become attached to everyday life. That realization frightened them at first. Then it gave them clarity. They understood that moving forward wasn't simply about forgetting you. It meant accepting that something meaningful had happened between you, whether or not the future looked exactly the way they once imagined. And for the first time, they weren't asking for certainty. They were asking for honesty. Your response made them pause again. You hadn't promised forever. You hadn't given them some perfect answer. But you had acknowledged something they desperately needed to hear. That the connection mattered to you too. That single realization softened something inside them. The decision that had once felt like a final line suddenly looked more like a turning point. They began wondering whether both of you had been waiting for the other person to make the first move. Maybe the distance wasn't rejection. Maybe it was fear. Maybe the story wasn't ending, it was finally becoming honest. And just when they thought they had said everything, you asked one final question. They stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, because they knew their next words could change the direction of everything. What they finally typed wasn't a promise. It was something much more powerful, the one truth they had been carrying silently from the very beginning. The truth they finally typed began with something so simple that they almost felt embarrassed for waiting this long to say it. I never wanted this to end without knowing what we could have become. They stared at those words before sending them, because suddenly every hesitation made sense. The final decision had never been about choosing between you and someone else. It had been about choosing between staying silent and finally being honest. They had spent so much time trying to protect themselves from disappointment that they had forgotten something important. Sometimes uncertainty hurts more than an honest answer. So they told you everything they had been unable to say face to face. They admitted that they had missed you. They admitted that they had wondered whether you still thought about them. And they admitted that even after trying to move forward, some part of them kept looking back, not because they were trapped in the past, but because they still believed there might be something unfinished between you. Then came the sentence that made the entire conversation feel different. I don't need you to promise me everything tonight. I just need to know if you're willing to be honest with me. There was no pressure behind it. No demand. Just an open door. And perhaps that was the most meaningful part of the entire message. They weren't asking you to predict the future. They weren't asking you to erase every misunderstanding or solve